In the heart of the Adirondack wilderness, where the mist clings to the trees and silence weighs heavier than words, a man trying to forget the world finds himself face to face with a mother's desperate plea. But this mother isn't human, she's a grieving bear, and her cub is slipping away. What unfolds next is not just a story of survival, but of trust, redemption, and the quiet, unspoken bond that can form between two beings from different worlds. This is a tale you won't forget. After the tragic loss of his young daughter in a car accident, Ethan, a former wildlife rescuer once known for his fierce dedication and empathy, abandons everything he once cared about. Overwhelmed by guilt and unable to bear the constant reminders of his failure, he resigns from his job, sells his home, and disappears into the dense solitude of the Adirondack Mountains. There, in a secluded, weather-worn cabin surrounded by towering pines and the whisper of wind through the branches, he seeks refuge from the world, and from himself. Each morning, Ethan wakes to the sound of silence, broken only by the creaking of trees and the occasional distant cry of an owl. He avoids mirrors, avoids photographs, avoids people. His days blur into one another, filled with meaningless tasks, chopping wood, watching snow fall, scribbling thoughts in a battered journal he rarely opens twice. The grief hangs over him like the mountain fog, thick, suffocating, and inescapable. Though he chose the isolation hoping it would numb the pain, Ethan finds no peace. Every creak of the floorboards at night reminds him of tiny footsteps he'll never hear again. He lashes out in moments of frustration, shouting into the trees, breaking dishes with trembling hands, but the silence always answers him back, unchanging, unforgiving. Beneath the surface, though, something stirs, a flicker of awareness that perhaps he's not meant to disappear. That perhaps the wilderness, instead of being his escape, might hold the first clues to redemption. But he resists this thought. For now, he clings to the belief that disappearing is the only way to keep the memory of his daughter alive, because to move forward would mean letting go. One bitter morning, as the first light of dawn barely pierced the gray fog that clung to the forest outside, Ethan sat slouched in his chair, wrapped in silence and shadows. His cabin, though warm from the wood-burning stove, felt cold, like a hollow shell echoing the emptiness inside him. He hadn't spoken a word to anyone in days. His routine had shrunk down to the bare minimum: heat a can of soup, stare at the fire, try not to remember. Then came the sound. Faint at first, almost like the distant creak of trees swaying in the wind. But it came again, sharper, fragile, unmistakably alive. A whimper. Ethan stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. He turned his head slowly toward the window, staring out into the white-draped stillness of the woods. Nothing. Just the frost and the quiet. Still, the sound lingered, almost as if it were calling him. Driven by a strange mix of curiosity and an unspoken urge he couldn't name, Ethan pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside, boots crunching in the frost-bitten earth. His eyes scanned the clearing around the cabin. That's when he saw it. At the edge of the woods, barely visible against the snow, was a dog. Its fur was thick and black, but it was caked with mud and blood, and its body trembled as it tried to stay upright. Its eyes, dulled with exhaustion, locked with his for a brief second, and something inside Ethan cracked. For a moment, he stood frozen. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to avoid entanglement, to preserve the fragile stillness he had built around his grief. But another part of him, buried but still breathing, moved his feet forward. He fetched an old wool blanket from inside and approached the dog carefully, kneeling beside it. The animal didn't resist. It simply lay there, too weak to flee, yet strangely trusting. Gently, Ethan wrapped it in the blanket and lifted it into his arms. The dog was light, too light, and he felt every rib beneath its fur. Inside the cabin, he laid the dog near the fire and tended to its wounds with water, bandages, and the quiet tenderness of someone who had once known how to care but had long forgotten. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The act itself, the presence of another living being who needed him, shook something loose in his chest. That night, as the dog slept curled in a tight ball by the fire, Ethan sat nearby, staring at the flames. His hands were still stained with blood, but they were steady. He felt the unfamiliar weight of responsibility, and strangely, it didn't scare him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the narrow gaps in the cabin's weathered shutters, painting the rough wooden walls with soft, golden hues. Ethan stirred, the creaking of his stiff joints breaking the silence. His body ached from the cold, his muscles tight and sore, but there was something else, an unfamiliar weight pressing down on his chest. For the past few days, he had felt disconnected from everything, the crushing loneliness of his self-imposed exile weighing on him. But that morning, the feeling was different. There was a quiet urgency to the stillness. He opened his eyes and instinctively turned his head toward the hearth, where the embers from the previous night's fire barely glowed. The familiar, rhythmic sound of his breath echoed through the cabin, but there was another sound. Softer. More fragile. The shallow, uneven breathing of the dog. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in days, his thoughts cleared. He pushed himself upright, groaning slightly at the stiffness in his back, and slowly rose to his feet. His gaze immediately found the dog, still lying on the rug by the hearth. The animal's eyes were half open, but it was clearly still weak. There was no movement in its body beyond the shallow rise and fall of its chest. The sight made something tighten in his throat. He stepped forward, his worn boots echoing faintly against the floorboards. As he crouched beside the dog, his fingers brushed the thick, matted fur. It was warm to the touch, but the warmth was fleeting, a stark contrast to the deep chill of the cabin that clung to the corners. He could see the dog's injuries clearly now. Its side was torn open, and its legs seemed to tremble with each shallow breath. He felt a pang of guilt twist in his stomach, knowing that his initial hesitation had cost it precious time. If he hadn't been so lost in his own isolation, maybe he could have done more earlier. But there was no time to dwell on that. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He couldn't save everyone, but he could save this one. He wasn't going to let it die like that, not in the cold silence of this forgotten place. He had to do something. Without thinking, he moved quickly to the small cabinet near the fire, pulling out a cloth and some water. His hands shook slightly, but it wasn't from fear. It was a raw surge of urgency. He soaked the cloth in the water and gently pressed it to the dog's wounds, wiping away the dried blood and dirt. The dog whimpered softly, but Ethan's touch was steady, reassuring in its own way. He whispered to it, though he wasn't sure why. It was just an instinct to soothe, to comfort. "You're okay. You're going to be okay." The animal seemed to recognize his voice. Its eyes flickered in his direction, tired but aware. Ethan looked into them, and for a moment, the world outside the cabin disappeared. In those brown eyes, he saw a reflection of himself, a being battered by circumstances, searching for a sliver of hope amidst the wreckage. It was an unsettling realization, and yet, it was comforting. They were in this together, both fighting against the relentless passage of time. After cleaning the wounds as best as he could, Ethan moved to prepare something warm for the dog. He made a broth from whatever scraps he had left, heating it over the fire with a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation. The fire crackled in the background, the room filled with the smell of the simmering liquid. When it was ready, he carefully ladled a small amount into a wooden bowl and brought it over to the dog. It took several tries before the dog finally drank, each sip slow and laborious, but it was something. A glimmer of life returned. As the dog settled back into sleep, Ethan leaned against the wall, his mind awash with conflicting emotions. The stillness of the cabin, the soft light spilling across the wooden floor, it all felt so fragile, so easily shattered. And yet, in that moment, he felt an unfamiliar weightlessness. For the first time in a long while, he had a purpose, even if it was as simple as ensuring that this small, injured creature survived. There was a deep connection between them now, something he couldn't quite articulate. He looked at the dog again, its breathing slower, steadier, the wounds not yet healed but no longer as desperate. His thoughts drifted back to the past, to a time when he had trusted others, when the world outside had felt less distant. He thought of his dog from years ago, Duke. The German shepherd who had been more than just a partner. More than a soldier's companion. Duke had been a lifeline, a silent understanding in the chaos of his life. And then, he thought of the day Duke had been taken from him, the hole it left in his heart that he hadn't known how to fill. Now, here he was with this new dog, a creature just as broken but just as capable of healing. He felt a sense of responsibility rising within him, a call to protect. Not just for the dog, but for something deeper inside himself, a part of him that he had buried long ago, afraid of what it meant to care again. "You're not alone," he whispered to the dog, though his words were as much for himself as they were for the animal. "Neither of us is." And with that simple promise, Ethan felt something stir inside him, a flicker of life, a reminder that even in the darkest places, there was still a chance for redemption. He wasn't sure what the future held, but as long as this dog was alive, there was something worth fighting for. And that, for the first time in what felt like forever, was enough. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the cabin. Inside, the only sounds were the steady crackling of the fire and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the dog. Ethan watched it closely, his gaze sharp and alert, though his body was still with exhaustion. He hadn't moved far since that first night when the dog had stumbled into his life. It was hard to shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in him, the weight of an unspoken promise pressing down on his chest. The small cabin, tucked away in the wilderness, had become his world, a place far from the noise of civilization, where he had hoped to find solitude. For years, Ethan had sought refuge here, away from the ghosts that haunted him, away from the grief that weighed heavy on his heart. It was here that he had thought he could finally quiet the turmoil within himself. But now, with the dog lying beside him, barely clinging to life, Ethan couldn't escape the flood of emotions that threatened to break through the dam he had built around himself. His mind wandered back to his time in the military, to the years spent on the front lines, to the brotherhood he had once shared with men and women who had been more family to him than his own blood. And then there was Duke, his partner, his companion. The German shepherd had been there through every mission, every challenge, every quiet night under the stars, watching his back when no one else could. Duke had understood him in a way that no one else could, their bond forged in the heat of battle. But now, Duke was gone. Gone in a way that left Ethan hollow. The pain of his loss was still fresh, even though the years had tried to numb it. Ethan had buried it deep, beneath the surface, telling himself that it was just another casualty of war, just another part of the job. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Duke had been his lifeline, his anchor, and when he had been taken from him, Ethan had felt himself start to unravel. So, when this dog appeared, bloodied and broken, something in Ethan had shifted. It was more than just a sense of duty, more than the instinct to help a creature in need. It was something primal. This dog represented a second chance, a lifeline thrown to him in a way he hadn't expected. He hadn't been prepared for it, hadn't expected to find himself caring so deeply for something he had barely known. But now, as he sat beside it, tending to its wounds and watching it slowly recover, he realized that maybe he wasn't as far removed from the man he used to be as he had believed. His hands trembled slightly as he checked the bandages around the dog's leg. The animal's pulse had slowed, its fever subsiding, and for the first time since he'd found it, Ethan felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. The dog's chest rose and fell steadily, its breathing less labored. Ethan let out a slow breath of his own, his fingers brushing lightly over the dog's fur, his touch gentle and deliberate. He hadn't realized how much he had missed this, how much he had missed feeling something again. The stillness of the cabin pressed in on him, but it wasn't suffocating this time. Instead, it felt like a quiet kind of peace. A peace that he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and Ethan found himself thinking of all the things he had closed off, the relationships, the people, the possibility of a future. He had buried them, told himself they were no longer his concern. But sitting here, in the quiet company of the dog, something inside him stirred. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was enough to make his heart ache with a kind of longing he hadn't felt in a long time. The dog stirred slightly, its brown eyes flickering open, locking onto Ethan's face. For a moment, the two of them just stared at each other, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Ethan didn't know what the dog was thinking, but there was something in its gaze that felt familiar. A shared understanding, a quiet recognition of the struggle they both faced. The dog was still weak, but its eyes were sharp, focused, and in them, Ethan saw something he hadn't seen in himself for a long time: strength. "Hey there," he whispered softly, as if speaking to the dog could somehow bridge the gap between his own brokenness and the hope that lingered just beyond his reach. "You're tougher than you look." His voice cracked slightly, a rare vulnerability creeping in, but he steadied himself before the words could fall apart completely. The dog's tail flicked once, a small, hesitant movement, and Ethan felt the slightest stir of hope, something that he hadn't let himself feel for years. He didn't know how much time they had left in this cabin, or what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. He sat there for a long time, the dog gradually settling into a more comfortable position, its eyes slowly closing once more as the warmth of the fire lulled it back into rest. Ethan stayed beside it, his hand still resting lightly on its head, unsure of the future but finally willing to face it. Maybe the dog wouldn't just survive this place. Maybe he wouldn't have to either. Maybe, together, they could find a way forward. Days had slowly turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Ethan felt the weight of his solitude settle deeper into his bones. The cabin, once a symbol of retreat from the world, now felt like both a sanctuary and a prison. The walls, though sturdy, seemed to close in around him, but the presence of Milo, the dog he had rescued, provided a strange comfort. Where Ethan had once felt the sting of isolation, there was now a subtle, healing connection between him and the animal. Ethan's routine had become a dance with silence, punctuated by the occasional sound of the wind rustling through the trees or the far-off call of birds. He would rise early, before the sun had fully broken the horizon, and head to the small stream near the cabin, where he would find peace in its quiet flow. Milo had come to be his constant companion, and the dog's ever-watchful eyes were a silent reassurance that Ethan wasn't truly alone, even in his most solitary moments. One morning, the sunlight filtered through the trees in delicate beams, casting shadows across the cabin's worn wooden floors. Ethan stood by the door, looking out over the land he had come to know intimately, every bend in the path, every hollow in the hills. He found himself at a crossroads. The grief of his past, the memories of his former life, still clung to him like a weight in his chest. But there was something else now, an unspoken connection to the land, to Milo, that had begun to shift something within him. It was a fragile thread, but it was enough to make him consider that maybe, just maybe, he could find a semblance of peace here. As Ethan prepared for another day of tending to the cabin, his thoughts drifted back to the war, those long, grueling missions, the brotherhood he had shared with his comrades, and the hollow feeling of returning home, only to be left with a shell of the man he once was. Duke's absence had carved a permanent hole in his heart, but it was a wound he had learned to live with. He glanced down at Milo, who was sitting at his feet, the dog's deep brown eyes full of quiet understanding. Without a word, Ethan crouched down and ruffled the dog's fur. Milo responded with a soft, appreciative whine, nuzzling his hand before padding off toward the woods. Ethan followed, a hesitant step behind, as if the dog was leading him on an unspoken journey. As they wandered through the woods, the morning fog still lingering in the lowlands, Ethan's mind began to clear. The forest, vast and silent, seemed to swallow up all his worries, leaving only the present moment. The crunch of fallen leaves beneath his boots, the rustling of branches above, the distant sound of a bird's call, everything felt connected, everything felt real in a way that the chaos of his former life had never allowed. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like he was just surviving. He felt alive. After an hour, they reached the stream, a familiar place of solace. Ethan sat on a moss-covered rock near the water, his legs stretched out before him. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds. He had learned to savor these moments of stillness, as they were becoming rarer in his life. The weight of his past, of the things he had done, the people he had lost, still lingered in the back of his mind, but it no longer consumed him. There was something comforting in the rhythm of nature, in the simplicity of the dog's movements and the peaceful murmur of the water. Milo splashed in the shallows, tail wagging energetically, and Ethan smiled faintly. The dog's carefree joy was contagious, and it reminded him of something he had long since forgotten, what it was like to live without the constant ache of loss. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life beyond the shadows of his past. A life where he could truly heal, where the pain no longer defined him. The thought was a fragile one, slipping through his mind like water through his fingers, but it lingered, warm and hopeful. And for the first time in ages, Ethan didn't feel the heavy weight of expectation on his shoulders. There was no mission, no obligation, just him, the dog, and the land. His reverie was interrupted by a low growl from Milo, followed by a sharp, sudden movement. The dog's posture was rigid, its muscles taut, eyes locked on something in the distance. Ethan's hand instinctively went to the rifle strapped to his back. His pulse quickened, but it wasn't fear that surged through him. It was alertness, readiness, the old training kicking in. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice low and steady as he crouched beside Milo, his gaze scanning the tree-line. Milo's eyes never left the shadows, his ears pinned back, his tail stiff behind him. Ethan stayed perfectly still, listening, waiting. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise, the quiet tension in the air thick and heavy. The world had gone silent again, as if holding its breath. Then, from the edge of the trees, a figure emerged, a man, tall and lean, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. He stepped carefully into view, hands raised slightly, as if to show he meant no harm. His eyes darted between Ethan and Milo, and for a moment, there was an unspoken standoff. Ethan didn't lower the rifle. His muscles were coiled, ready for whatever might come next. The man spoke, his voice calm but carrying a hint of uncertainty. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'm lost. I was hoping for some directions." Ethan studied him, the rifle still steady in his hands. His eyes flicked to Milo, who had yet to relax. The dog's instincts were sharp, and Ethan trusted them implicitly. Yet there was something about the man's demeanor, his lack of aggression, that gave him pause. This wasn't an immediate threat. Still, the tension was thick, palpable. "Stay where you are," Ethan said, his voice low and controlled. "Tell me who you are." The man's hands remained raised, but there was a slight tremor in his voice. "I'm just a hiker," he said, a bit too quickly. "I got turned around." "It's not far back to the road, is it?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. His gaze never left the stranger's face, weighing his words, assessing his every movement. Milo, still standing at Ethan's side, had calmed slightly but remained vigilant. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what to make of the situation, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. "You're not going anywhere until I decide what to do with you," he said, his voice cool and deliberate. The man nodded, his eyes flicking nervously to the rifle before meeting Ethan's unwavering gaze again. "I understand. I'm not looking for trouble. Just a little help." Ethan stayed silent, considering the man's words. It wasn't the kind of situation he was used to. This wasn't an enemy soldier or a threat that could be easily neutralized. It was a hiker, someone who might be lost, someone who might need help. Ethan wasn't sure, but he knew he had to make a choice. And as he looked at the stranger, something deep inside him stirred. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, a man defined by the wounds of war. He was someone different now, someone who had learned to listen, to trust his instincts, and maybe, just maybe, to extend a hand to someone else who needed it. With a final glance at Milo, Ethan slowly lowered the rifle, the tension slowly ebbing from his body. "All right," he said, his voice steady, but there was a hint of something new in it, something like hope. "Let's see if we can get you back on track." Sometimes, the wild doesn't just challenge our instincts, it rewrites them. In the stillness of a cabin and the thunder of a storm, a wounded heart met a wounded soul, and something rare happened. Not every hero wears a uniform. And not every plea for help comes in words. If this story moved you, share it, and let the world see that even in the darkest woods, compassion finds a way.